It began with whispers of children disappearing along the Mississippi River, just as the sun struggled to pierce the morning mist. By 1803, towns along the water were marked by vanished faces. Small African-American children, often last seen, playing near the docks or fetching water from the river. Some claimed they were stolen by river spirits. Others said the families had simply vanished, but no record exists. Among the few traces left behind, one name surfaces again and again in hushed confessions: Kunta Kinte. But this is not the Kunta Kinte the world knows from popular memory, a figure of resistance, a symbol on a page. This Kunta was different, older, ancestral, connected to the very soil of America in ways historians never acknowledged. He survived the Middle Passage but found no sanctuary. The institutions meant to shelter him, the churches, the orphanages, were not sanctuaries at all. They were laboratories for a cruelty that had mutated from centuries of slavery into something even more insidious: the study of obedience, fear, and the erasure of identity. We begin here, at the edge of memory, where history bends under the weight of secrets no one dared record. Somewhere between the whispers of rivers and the unmarked graves of orphan children, something monstrous was born, not in the bodies of men, but in the shadowed spaces of power, in the hearts of those claiming to save souls. Close up, a splintered, wooden toy in mud, half buried as a child's laughter echoes faintly, warped. By 1821, small towns across Virginia and the Carolinas were dotted with orphanages that, in the daylight, appeared orderly and devout. Their facades were immaculate: whitewashed walls, perfectly trimmed lawns, and bell towers signaling the hour of prayer. Behind those walls, however, was a different rhythm, entire rhythm of fear, of hunger, and of silenced voices. Children like Kunta were delivered not as orphans but as vessels of experimentation. They were fed, bathed, and educated only to be slowly stripped of their language, their memories, their lineage. There are records of obedience tests, cruel games disguised as moral instruction, often performed before the clergy themselves. Punishments were designed not only to hurt but to fragment the mind. Hours of isolation in dark rooms, chains barely seen under folds of clothing, whispered commands in languages that were not their own, they all served a singular purpose: to de-sever the soul from its history. The priests and matrons claimed to be God's instruments, but their God had a face of stone. Letters from one orphanage superintendent described the ancestral energy of African children as dangerous, something to be broken and harnessed. In that context, Kunta Kinte was more than a boy. He was a threat, a living connection to a past a new world refused to acknowledge. And the deeper the administration buried his lineage, the louder his ancestors' voices screamed in silence. Sound cue, distant chant, muffled sobbing, creaking floorboards late at night. The orphans whispered about the red door in the basement of the orphanage. No adult admitted it existed, and yet every child who dared approach described the same stench: iron, decay, and something far older. It was said that behind the door, the matron would perform rituals, prayers that did not invoke salvation but control. Ceremonies designed to twist the children's minds into obedience. Kunta, unlike the others, resisted. He whispered names in his native Mandinka tongue, words his captors could not understand. The priests, sensing the persistence of this ancient spirit, began marking him as dangerous. Candles were placed around him in the dead of night. Chanting filled the halls. The children claimed that shadows moved independently, almost alive, responding to the tension of fear and power. These rituals, historians later dismissed as folklore, were part of a larger pattern. Across the South, institutions ran what some elders quietly called memory purges, a systematic attempt to sever African children from their ancestry. Each ceremony was both punishment and instruction, a way to condition obedience and erase rebellion. For Kunta, each ritual was a reminder of the chains of history stretching across centuries, a chain he refused to bend. Visual, flickering candlelight illuminating a boy's wide, terrified eyes, distant echo of a heartbeat. Outside the orphanage, the town seemed quaint, picturesque, a postcard of early 19th century America. But at night, the streets told a darker story. Families whispered about a hidden ledger kept by the church, a record of every child who vanished, every prayer misused, every secret deal. Kunta, in stolen moments, watched the town's elders. They walked in shadowed corridors, exchanged knowing glances and spoken codes learned over decades. One elder, a former sea captain who had trafficked slaves along the coast, muttered about the African ghost that refused to die as he pressed a hand to his chest. Kunta began to notice patterns. Disappearances coincided with church holidays. Orphans who resisted the institution's authority simply vanished, leaving behind only clothes folded neatly as if the bodies were never there. And yet, no outsider questioned the town. Newspapers ignored the stories, and census records showed nothing but neat, orderly populations. Kunta began to understand that this was not mere negligence, it was a conspiracy, a silent agreement to protect the secret machinery of fear. He also realized that the land itself remembered. Rivers carried whispers. Trees absorbed screams. Every stone was a witness. And somewhere beneath it all, the echo of his ancestors waited, a pulse of rage and grief that could not be erased. Audio cue. Wind rustling through empty streets. Distant dog barking. Kunta's first attempt to flee. The orphanage was silent and desperate. He waited for a stormy night, when thunder-massed footsteps and rain soaked the grounds. As he crawled through a hidden tunnel behind the pantry, he felt the weight of centuries pressing against him, the chains of his ancestors, both literal and spiritual, warning him of the danger ahead. He made it to the edge of the river, where moss and mud clung to his limbs. He could hear voices calling him back, not human voices but something older. Warnings, ancestral advice, the lament of those who had already been consumed by the institution's rituals. Yet courage surged. He stepped into the current, letting it carry him downstream. By dawn, he was found, but Kunta had changed. He no longer feared the matron. He feared forgetting, feared the loss of his heritage. And the priests had changed too. They began documenting him more closely, observing him as though he were both a subject and a threat, studying how defiance could survive centuries of indoctrination. Visual: young boy kneeling in the river, water swirling around his feet, lightning illuminating his determined face. By 1835, Kunta was transferred to a seminary for gifted children, a place supposedly devoted to spiritual cultivation. The walls were lined with portraits of founders, but there was something wrong about their eyes, almost alive, watching. The corridors echoed not just footsteps but whispers of the long dead, African ancestors whose names had been excised from history. Seminaries like this were not sanctuaries, they were laboratories of fear. Kunta learned Latin, theology, and obedience, but also watched as children with darker skin were systematically isolated, punished, and psychologically broken. The teachers spoke of divine purpose while practicing rituals reminiscent of the orphanage, designed to sever memory and enforce submission. Kunta's defiance grew, not just in action but in mind. He memorized forbidden texts in secret, stories of African kingdoms, his own lineage, and whispered them to other children in hidden corners. The seminary was a cage, but Kunta discovered cracks. In those cracks, he began to glimpse the truth. The corruption went far beyond this one. Place it was nationalist, systematic, a silent inheritance of fear. Sound cue: distant chanting, echoing footsteps in a stone hallway, a door slamming somewhere far away. At night, Kunta spoke in whispers, teaching other children the words of his ancestors. He called it the language of shadows, Mandinka, phrases that held power, a lifeline to a world adults wanted buried. The seminary walls, thick with stone and sermons, seemed to pulse against him. One evening, he traced a hand along the walls and felt a strange vibration, like echoes of long-forgotten voices beneath layers of paint and plaster. It was as if the very building remembered the suffering it had witnessed, recording it like a living archive. Those who resisted, those like Kunta, became targets for the priest's discipline. A slow, deliberate unraveling of body and mind. The rituals escalated. Children were confined in pitch-black rooms for days, subjected to sermons delivered in whispers and shadows, threatened with figures in robes who had no names. Kunta noticed that fear itself was treated as a substance, something the priests could mold, extract, and redistribute. He began keeping count: every missing child, every unnatural injury, every whisper that seemed to haunt the walls. He committed them to memory, unwilling to let history forget. Sound cue: faint chains clinking, low chanting, heartbeat like drumming. Kunta discovered a hidden ledger in the seminary archives. The pages were brittle, ink-faded, but unmistakable. The names of children who had vanished, often with dates and cryptic codes. Some were marked with symbols he didn't recognize, others with stains resembling blood. Each name was a story, erased, yet preserved in this macabre inventory. It became clear the orphanage and the seminary were parts of a larger network, a covert system designed to manipulate, hide, and control African-descended children across the region. Kunta traced his own name among the entries, accompanied by dates that suggested experiments, transfers, and punishments too horrifying to contemplate. He began memorizing the ledger, committing it to memory. Every night, the voices of those erased whispered their gratitude and their warnings, urging him to resist, to survive. It was knowledge both terrifying and sacred, the only weapon he had against a system determined to erase him. Visual: trembling hands flipping a fragile ledger, candlelight illuminating red-stained ink. The Mississippi, winding and relentless, became Kunta's confessor. At its banks, he whispered stories of his ancestors, seeking counsel from the currents. The river carried more than water, it carried memory, a pulse of voices from the Middle Passage, from plantations, from nameless graves. He realized the river was a mirror to the institutions he endured, calm on the surface, violent underneath. Every current was a warning, every eddy a message. Here Kunta understood that the world he inhabited was designed not only to control bodies but to suffocate memory, to extract the very essence of African identity. Sound cue, rushing water. Faint crying, wind rustling through trees. The matron of the seminary, Mrs. Blackwood, became a symbol of omnipresent fear. Her eyes, cold, calculating, unblinking, seemed to pierce the very soul. She knew Kunta's defiance, his secret whispers, his memorization of forbidden knowledge. At night, children claimed she moved through walls, a shadow appearing where she shouldn't be. She was said to speak in tongues older than the country itself, invoking authority not merely from God but from ancestors unknown, terrifying, and vengeful. Kunta understood then that the institution's cruelty had evolved, merging religious zeal with a perverse, almost occult obsession with control. Visual, a shadow stretching unnaturally across candlelit hallways. Kunta was not alone. Others, like him, carried fragments of their pasts, shards of ancestral memory he had never learned from adults. Together, they formed secret societies in corners, cellars, and attic rituals of remembrance and silent rebellion. They called themselves the Keepers. Their ceremonies were quiet but potent, a whisper of a Mandinka song, a shared breath, a promise to survive. Every time a child vanished, the group marked the walls with hidden symbols, a silent ledger that no adult could interpret. Sound cue, quiet, rhythmic tapping, children's whispered language, faint hum of ancestral voices. One morning, a boy, named Malik, was found lifeless in the chapel. No wounds, no explanation, only the look of sheer terror frozen on his face. Kunta understood immediately. The seminary was watching, testing limits. Fear had become a weapon, an invisible instrument. Every corner of the institution seemed alive, observing, judging. Kunta's own defiance grew stronger, tempered by the knowledge that survival required cunning, patience, and secrecy. Visual, morning sunlight casting long shadows over a marble floor, the boy's shoes neatly aligned. Kunta discovered a hidden passage beneath the seminary, a tunnel network stretching beneath the town. It connected churches, orphanages, and perhaps even private estates, a subterranean map of oppression. The walls were etched with names and symbols, some African, some arcane. Kunta realized the adults had relied on these passages to move children, to conduct rituals unseen. Every step through the tunnel was a step into the collective trauma of countless souls. Visual candlelight flickering against stone walls, shadows twisting like living forms. An elder, a former matron, finally spoke to Kunta in whispers. She confessed the institution's purpose: to erase memory, to manipulate generations of African-descended children into compliant vessels. The old woman trembled, eyes wide. We thought we were saving them, but we were building a machine of fear, and it will never end. Kunta listened, recording every word in his memory. This confession, more than any ritual or punishment, illuminated the depth of horror he was up against. Audio, trembling voice, wind howling through unseen cracks. Late one night Kunta had a vision. The ancestors appeared, not as spirits but as fragments of memory, demanding recognition. They showed him rivers, plantations, ships, and graves, a panorama of suffering and resilience. He understood that the trauma was not only historic, it was living, active, feeding the institutions that sought to suppress it. Kunta vowed that he would survive, not only for himself but for the countless forgotten children. Visual, ghostly silhouettes of ancestors moving across the landscape. In 1847, a fire consumed part of the seminary. The adults blamed a child, but Kunta knew the truth. The fire was accidental, born of neglect and fury. Yet the blaze revealed hidden documents, ledgers, and maps previously unseen. Kunta scavenged them, committing every name, every location, to memory. The fire became both a curse and a revelation, a literal and symbolic illumination of suppressed truths. Visual flames reflected in soot-stained windows, shadows writhing on walls. Kunta confronted Mrs. Blackwood directly, in the empty chapel. He spoke in Mandinka, in a voice both trembling and commanding, naming every child who had vanished. The matron recoiled, as if struck, and for the first time, fear mirrored itself in her eyes. It was a small victory, ephemeral, yet profound. Kunta understood that knowledge, memory, and courage were as dangerous to the system as any weapon. Sound cue. Echoes of chanting, footsteps halted mid-step. Kunta formed a secret network to help children escape through the tunnels, across rivers, and into towns where sympathetic families hid them. Each success was a defiance, a reclamation of identity stolen by generations of institutional cruelty. The Keepers grew, moving silently through shadows, leaving markers for future generations, ensuring that no child was ever truly lost to memory. Again, visual, a group of children slipping through tunnels, torchlight flickering across determined faces. By 1850, Kunta had memorized every record, every secret, every code. He created his own ledger on paper, but in memory, in story, in song. It contained the names of the vanished, the rituals, the locations, and the warnings. It was a living record, impossible to destroy, hidden within the mind of a single boy who would become a man, a vessel of history no institution could erase. Visual Kunta sitting by the river, murmuring names into the current. Kunta Kinte disappeared from the seminary one night, leaving only whispers behind. Some say he fled north. Others claim he merged with the river itself, becoming one with the memory of his people. What he left was a secret that America never wanted told, that oppression is not only physical, but psychic, that trauma can live for generations, and that memory, courage, and song are weapons against erasure. And somewhere, in towns, orphanages, and rivers across the South, his legacy whispers still, waiting for those brave enough to listen. Closing visual. Mist over a river at dawn. Faint voices murmuring names. Camera pulling back to endless water.